All right, we're there.
I felt that.
Felt it. It was like, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll go to where she has it.
Okay.
Remember, dogs don't feel pain like we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not even that noticeable.
And welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast, and happy Veterans Day to everybody. Today, we are going to do something we've never done before. We're going to review 2 movies in one episode. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe. Let us know if you agree with our choices or if you have a different movie suggestion for Veterans Day. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and let's dive in. Your Moviness, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. I'm doing great. Got excited for the weekend and saw a new movie that was pretty interesting. Out of curiosity, how did you hear about The Greatest Beer Run Ever?
I was actually it was actually a year ago. I was driving to work and I was listening to 106.5 and they just happened to mention it. And they said, "Oh yeah, it's about this guy who was delivering beer to his friends in Nam." And I was like, "Oh, okay, that sounds fun." And I read a little bit more into it, and I was curious to learn that was based on a true story.
Yes.
So that kind of piqued my interest there. And you and I, we've seen Good Morning Vietnam, and that's also based on it's not necessarily based on a true event, but based on an actual person.
Yes.
So both movies that we're reviewing today are based on actual individuals during the Vietnam War, and
Both comedies as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I was gonna say their approach to humor is quite different, but very individualistic, if that makes any sense. Um so I rewatched Good Morning Vietnam earlier today just to just to get my feet wet and reacquainted with the whole movie, and I watched The Greatest Beer Run Ever last night. You did the same thing. You
Yes.
pretty much followed the same pattern.
We did.
So let's start off with Good Morning Vietnam, just because that's a movie that we're both familiar with. Now this was one of Robin Williams' earlier films. It was made in '87, and it's based on the life of Adrian Cronauer, who actually worked as a radio DJ in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And I watched it several years ago, and I rewatched it again when you mentioned it a few months ago when you said you saw it. So it prompted me to watch it, and then this will be the third time that I've seen it. And then The Greatest Beer Run Ever. I saw that it was Zac Efron. I thought, it's just him, just doing another hokey character. It's him just, doing whatever. But I was actually impressed with the movie.
Yeah.
Overall, like
Yeah.
I watched and I was like, damn, this is pretty good.
Yeah.
And can I say, I'm actually glad to see Russell Crowe doing an accent that actually suits him.
I knew you were going to say that. I knew there would be no way to escape having a discussion where Russell Crowe is doing an accent. You don't bring it up. So, but yes, he did. I think that in The Greatest Beer Run Ever, right, Zac Efron as Chickie, I think he did a great job with it, right? I mean, I think he kind of hit that kind of those kind of like humor in the way they want to do the humor, right? It was kind of as I think the humor in Good Morning Vietnam I liked a lot more than the humor in The Greatest Beer Run Ever. They definitely attacked it in 2 different ways that they wanted to do that.
But it worked for them.
It
really did. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think for Good Morning Vietnam, Robin Williams was just doing his stand-up, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
It
was pretty much Robin Williams in South Vietnam, basically.
Yes, exactly. Yes, which, like I said, I think speaks volumes about Robin Williams. And then Zac Efron, I think, it's a very bizarre premise, right? So The Greatest Beer Run Ever, a story about a character named Chickie, right? That is
Chickie Donohue, yeah.
Yes, thank you. And he is literally bringing beer to his friends in Vietnam, right? Literally, that's what he's
Yeah.
doing. It's a literal beer run. So it is very truthful with that. And I think Efron does do a very strong job of doing that character. And I think the comedy makes sense for that type of story because it is a very bizarre premise, right? Like if someone's like, yeah, this person's doing a beer run to Nam, like I think you do have to have a certain level of how you do the comedy with that because it is such a bizarre premise, right?
Because I mean,
It
it's a
almost
story.
seems like it was a joke by
Yeah, because
just
it's a
like
story.
hearing
It's a
the
story. Yeah, because it's a story that you don't believe it's real until you actually read about it.
Exactly. Yes. So you kind of have to go with a different option with that. Whereas like Robin Williams, I really like how they did the comedy in that more, where the comedy wasn't really it was more just his interactions with people, but then you still had a lot of dramatic elements towards the whole Vietnam conflict going on. As is like with The Greatest Bear Whenever, they kind of like try to intermingle it. And like I said, sometimes it worked, sometimes it just didn't. So I guess it goes to how each of the movies wanted to kind of tackle that angle. But obviously, I think Robin Williams, I mean, just such a fantastic job in that movie. And, I think a lot of us, when you think of Robin Williams, you think of the comedy, but man, could he really, that anger, the intensity, the sadness, like that guy could flat out act.
Right.
And it just, I think, unfortunately trying to kind of compare the two leads, right? Cronauer with Robin Williams and then Chickie with Zac Efron. I think Robin Williams really just kind of, does such a fantastic job, and I think just does better than Efron. And that's not a slight against Efron. I think he did great, but I think it just shows how great of an actor Robin Williams was. So,
but I mean, you couldn't. But I mean, you couldn't bring that same level to the Greatest Beer Run ever. Because,
no, yes,
because it requires a different level of acting, and different level of humor, like you said.
yes.
So for those of y'all who haven't seen the movie, and if you haven't, what the hell's wrong with you? Good Morning Vietnam is basically about real life DJ Adrian Cronauer, who comes to Vietnam to work at the army radio station, and in the movie, his subversive humor kind of gets under the skin of his superiors, namely Dickerson, and throughout the movie, they're really. Like you said a few minutes ago, it's based more about around his interaction with people than there actually is like a general like story, like act 1, act 2, act 3. Like he's kind of a man who acts as an everyman. He's kind of thrown to the situation of the chaos of the Vietnam War, and we witness the war through his eyes.
Yes.
Whereas with Zac Efron, you kind of know like where he's going, because he starts off in New York. He makes a plan to go to Vietnam. He goes to Vietnam. He goes through all these different places, and then he comes home, right? So in Good Morning Vietnam, basically, Cronauer he befriends he tries to make an acquaintance with the lady, and he befriends her brother, who helps him out to try to get to know her. And he besides being a radio DJ, he teaches English to some Vietnamese people. And then during one attempt to try to go interview the troops, he gets caught in an ambush, and then he gets discharged because the brother of the girl he's trying to be acquainted with turns out to be VC, and he's dishonorably discharged and sent home. I will say this: the humor in Good Morning Vietnam is more on the nose. You know what I mean? It's kind of more in your face. Like when it's humor, it's humor. Like it's supposed to be a funny scene. It's kind of like those old sitcoms from like the 80s and 90s where if the audience laughed, you knew it was supposed to be a funny moment. Whereas with Greatest Beer Run, it was more like it's more like one of those comedy shows you see streaming on Netflix or Hulu, where you kind of have to get the feel for the story to know when it's funny, But that isn't to say that that one's funnier than the other. It's just that their approach to the comedy is different, and really it's just based it's just based more on the time period, because obviously Good Morning Vietnam was made in the 80s. So, so the way that people understood, the humor, the cues for humor are going to be more different than what they were in 2022 when Greatest Beer Run was ever made. Um, so obviously you and I were introduced to Good Morning Vietnam first. Um, what what were your overall thoughts on that movie when you watched it?
Yeah, so I think for me, the way I kind of looked at it was, I feel like in subsequent watchings, I just enjoy it more and more. I think it's something that ages very well, and I think number one, Robin Williams, it just absolutely does fantastic with that role. I know I talked about it very briefly, but I mean, like, just his performance, just like with the way he's able to just kind of be very lighthearted at times, but also sinks into some of those incredibly low lows, right? And I think in your synopsis, right, you did a great job of helping describe it. And it's interesting because initially you kind of, see his whole purpose for joining the English class, right, to teach the Vietnamese people. The whole point of that was to try to get with, I believe her name was Tin.
Yeah.
Was trying to get with, one of the characters, and then almost that whole story, it does kind of play in the background, but more it's the friendship between Robin Williams' Cronauer character and the girl's brother, Tuan. That ends up being kind of the main fleshed out story, and it is a very, very interesting story. I really liked how they did that.
It was a pretty good misdirection too, because
yes, absolutely. Like you would not.
Because you're thinking the entire time he's trying to get, he's trying to, well, not to be vulgar, he's trying to get into her pants, and then he kind of develops a more meaningful relationship with someone else,
Exactly, yeah. You're not expecting it. It definitely takes a very, a very different change, and you start to see like a lot of that, and even the ending, I think, just has such an impact to it.
Oh, it was so heartfelt,
Oh yes, absolutely, because you spend the full movie talking about kind of, seeing their relationship and everything, and you see like Robin Williams at the beginning, right, when they go to the GI bar. You see a bunch of soldiers come over and they're harassing Tuan, and he does have a problem, really kind of stepping up for him, right? He wants to show him like, hey, I can help support you, kind of gets in their faces. And I think that's very telling, because when that bar gets bombed later, you see him trying to get him out. And I think at the time, while you're not thinking about it, you're like, oh, it was just kind of coincidence that he got out of there. But then as you find out later on, that actually Tuan was the one that was bombing the bar. So him going in there was to ultimately protect Robin Williams. And I think that just really adds a very different element when you do watch it on multiple viewings, because you start to kind of see some of that stuff. Kind of the same thing where later on in the story, where Robin Williams is in the Jeep with Forrest Whitaker's character.
Garlic, yeah.
Thank you. Well, sorry, what was the name?
Garlic.
Garlic, thank you. Yes, Garlic. So, when they're, on the Jeep or whatever, and, really Tuan goes out there and wrestles him in, really bad territory, right? Where there's a lot of Viet Cong and everything that's around there. And you actually see our group of people being chased. So just kind of another instance of him going out of his way to help protect Robin Williams. So there's a lot of kind of like ulterior motives and everything like that. But I think it does, create this great thing. And, the kind of like the final part where you have that kind of chase scene at the very end, where Robin Williams is trying to confront him. There's just so much power behind everything that's happened. And actually between Robin Williams and Tuan, they do such a great job of just showing that, for Robin Williams, he looks at it like, hey, we're over here trying to help you guys. And then Tuan's like, maybe not, right? My mom is dead. I believe his older brother is dead. Like, he's lost people, he's lost neighbors, he's lost a lot of people in this conflict. So it's one of those things where the war was very gray. And as I said, like both me and you, right, we didn't live during the war, right? I think we're going through it with a different lens, whereas I think for older generations, right, you have a much firmer mindset of what it is. So I just want to throw that out there that you're talking, you got two people that are just talking about what they've seen through media and other things. We didn't live through these moments that like some people might have, that some people did live through.
Well, to be
But
fair, to be fair, my parents did live in the country next over, so. And,
oh, well, there you go. Right. So got a little bit more probably firsthand knowledge of some of those things that happen. But yeah, like that's just something I always found very interesting. But as I said, with something like this, there is a lot of gray, right? There's a lot of things that happen, and I think that just goes for any war, right? That there's unfortunate casualties that happen, and there's a lot of that stuff that I think doesn't get depicted very well. And I think that this kind of shows that Tuan is a very complex character, right? He's somebody that befriends Robin Williams probably to get closer to America, right? And to be able to do some of the stuff he has maybe planned in his mind. There could be some of that going on from the very get-go that you're not aware of.
Because they were each using one another initially.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So, this easily could have been something that was kind of orchestrated or planned, but it was just something where, he's, doing this bombing, and obviously Robin Williams, was obviously devastated by it. And, I think Tuan to a certain extent is as well. But he's, a younger person that's lashing out at what he feels like the injustices, and that's how he's wanting to deal with it. And it is just I think they just did such a great job of getting so much depth to this character. And, I think he really, has so much. It would be very interesting to see more about Tuan's story. I think that's something that we see bits and pieces of, but, kind of knowing more about the backstory, I think there's a lot that's going on there.
Well, I was gonna say, when you were watching it, today, did you kind of get the feeling that Cronauer was hoping that Tuan would kind of convert to the American way? Like, did you get that feeling? Because in my mind, I was thinking, Cronauer's upset that he's been dishonorably discharged because of Tuan, but he's also feeling betrayed. And I think, at least for me, I think the betrayal comes from the fact that he thought Tuan was actually going to root for the Americans. I thought he was actually going to, become an American himself. And when Tuan, lashes out and says, you guys are causing so much harm to me and my country, it was pretty much like a stab in the back for him, and he felt like a failure because he thought he was getting to him, and it turns out he didn't.
Actually, I'm gonna go the complete opposite. I never really got that impression. I never got that Robin Williams was really, and I think this is probably just Robin Williams and the type of character he plays, but I never really got that strong sense of like patriotism from him, where I think in The Greatest Beer Run Ever, like Chickie's a lot more, I think pro-Nam, whereas I never really got that feeling with Robin Williams. I just didn't really feel it. I think where all of his emotions were coming from was really a lot more on a personal level, where he was just upset that he was a friend that betrayed him. I didn't see any of that America versus Vietnamese type of aspect with it. I thought that it was more just a really straightforward relationship that he felt betrayed by someone that he was very close to, and that was the reason for the lash on. That was the reason for everything. So at least that's how I perceived it when I watched it. It was more just this guy that befriended somebody else, and all skin color, rationale, and everything aside, they were friends, and he had a severe betrayal with what happened.
Right. Well, I mean, another thing too, because because if you watch any of the footage from that period, or if you're watching those documentaries, I mean, obviously during that time period, the White House was trying to portray the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong as the enemy. But like you said, I mean, there are just so many layers to it, because even though Tuan is ostensibly the enemy or the adversary because he's VC, his actions kind of speak otherwise, and in a way you can sort of sympathize with what he's doing,
Yeah,
because
you can at least understand what he's
yeah,
doing. I think, like, I could get the rationale. Obviously, um, the bombings, you're both impacting both, American soldiers, but you're also killing other Vietnamese people. It's kind of like, something I think we see a lot more nowadays. Unfortunately, we see some of that kind of cross casualty that happens.
right.
But yeah, like you said, like, I think I understand his rage, right? I think that's the big thing, is I get the rage, and well, obviously I can't really say I agree with his methods for taking care of things. I can certainly understand a character that has had so much loss, looking for an outlet for their anger, and he chose kind of a very dramatic way, or a very drastic way of going out and showing it.
Now, speaking of antagonists, the big one in the movie is Dickerson, because
Yes.
from beginning to end, this there's nothing about him that makes you think, huh, there's I can sort of understand where he's coming from, unlike with Twan, because with Dickerson, to quote General Taylor, he's just mean.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think he plays that role so well, like, totally straight laced. He's 100%. There's a lot of conflict between them because, Dickerson in essence wants to kind of not provide a whole lot of clarity on everything. Like, there's some censorship going on with what they want to discuss, right? And he's very, very straight laced with, the type of music that needs to play. So there's like kind of all these things that kind of build up where he's very much the anti Robin Williams or the anti Cronauer, right? Like, he's just everything. He despises everything about it. I'm sure he said just as much somewhere in the film. He pretty much despises everything about his character. So I think he does a great job of depicting that. He really is a thorn in Robin Williams' side throughout the full film. And it is, like I said, kind of, I think, very gratifying in the end, where he gets moved to Guam,
Yeah.
and that's where he's stationed. So at least a little comeuppance there for a guy that not only gave Robin Williams a bad time, but seems to have just just an overall negative rapport with a lot of people.
Yeah, and another thing too, the fact that he intentionally kind of
Oh yeah,
planned that trip. I'm like, yeah, this is a pretty vindictive guy.
yeah.
Like,
Like, it
he
gets
has
out of,
no saving grace whatsoever at
yeah.
all.
No, absolutely not. Like, it's, yeah, and that's a great point, right? Like, I think you could have disagreements with people, you could really be annoyed with somebody, but when you start, like, allowing him to purposely go into an area that to be dangerous, that's why I feel like you're definitely crossing the line, right? Because now you're almost, I mean, you're in essence, you're trying to kill him, right? Like, you're not doing it directly, right? But you're indirectly would have caused his death if he was to die, because you knew you're putting him into an area that had a lot of VC activity that you knew to be dangerous.
Well, another thing too, another thing that stood out to me was the fact that was that during the time that Cronauer was in there, obviously he has to deal with censorship, but it's also the fact that he feels like he has an obligation to the truth, and obviously the people at the radio station aren't having any of that. That's kind of and it kind of contrasts beautifully with what's going on in the greatest beer run ever, where we remember where Chickie's in the bar and he's having an argument with the journalists about about the fact that what they're reporting is is not is not helpful to to the soldiers and to the American public, because what they're reporting is pretty much just causing all these major protests to kind of
Yeah.
just say, hey, these soldiers are just a bunch of baby killers and all that stuff. So it's a pretty huge contrast between these two characters, because one is obsessed with trying to get the truth out, and the other one is, well, for lack of a better word, he's trying to suppress it for the sake of morale.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So so I want to jump to the greatest beer run ever. And we can go back to Good Morning Vietnam in a little bit, but with the greatest beer run ever, for those of y'all who haven't seen it, it came out last year, and it's based on a true story about John Chickie Donohue, who is a merchant marine who makes this bold declaration that he's going to deliver beers to all of his neighborhood buddies in Vietnam, and he gets there and he's going through shit basically, to try to get you know, PBRs, and they make it very clear they're Pabst Blue Ribbons
Yes.
to all these, you know, to all of his friends, or most of his friends, throughout different parts of Vietnam, and it chronicles his numerous adventures in doing that.
Yeah. The movie's a very long PBR commercial.
Pretty much. But if we
Yeah.
if we can divorce PBR from the equation, it's, I mean, it's just as harrowing and it's just as moving as Good Morning Vietnam. You know,
Mm.
you have an issue with that? What do
Yeah,
tell?
I'm not gonna go that far. So, and yeah, by the way, did a little bit of research, right? Because you got to make sure you're prepared. So, something that I also found interesting, there was actually a small PBR documentary that's posted on their YouTube channel, for Pabst Blue Ribbon, that kind of has a little bit about the greatest beer run ever. Thought that was interesting. Just want to throw that out there if anyone was interested in getting more of the story. But yeah, I'm actually going to say that I felt like the biggest difference between what Good Morning Vietnam did and what the greatest beer run ever did was the fact that I didn't get as invested with the story that they were telling in the greatest beer run ever. And I think a lot of that just deals with kind of the storytelling. I guess I'll kind of dive into that. So I think one of my challenges is with the Good Morning Vietnam, I felt like the story was very structured. You got a whole lot of story about, Robin Williams, and we see a lot of his interaction with Tuan, and that's really where everything kind of revolves with the story. I like how the story was very concise, and it really kept to a very small group of characters. With the greatest beer run ever, I felt like it was all over the place. There was just too many people involved with it. And I get that, this is a true story, and I'm going to put air quotes around that because I know the presence is real, but how much we see, I don't know how much of what actually was depicted in the movie was real. But I think you don't really get as much out of the story. It felt more surface level, whereas I felt like with Good Morning Vietnam, it was more in depth. So, with the greatest beer run ever, he's got all these friends, and it's just like, you don't really know the friends, right? You don't really get to see their interactions. So, like, when you're seeing the friends, right, you should be excited for that, right? Like, when he meets the friends, I'm like, hey, I should be really engaged with this. But the truth is, I'm really not, because I never met these characters before. Obviously, they mean a lot to Chickie, and, we're rooting for Chickie this whole time, but I don't care about these characters because you never promoted or showed anything with it. Even the character Tommy, who kind of plays, I think, a relatively big role in the film, really his screen presence, I think, was just maybe one or two scenes. Like, I don't think he's in it for more than 2 minutes. Whereas Tommy was, I think Tommy was kind of one of the big reasons that Chickie went over there was because, you find out that Chickie really pushed Tommy to enlist. So he feels a little bit of guilt over Tommy's situation, and unfortunately finding out later on that Tommy was killed in action. So you kind of get the sense that, there's a lot more emotion there, but I think the problem that I have is you don't really see much of Tommy. Like, the movie, I think it starts off a little too slow. And I wish they focused less on everything else and more on just one core element, right? Like, if you want to talk about Tommy, it would have been a lot more interesting if, he goes to Nam and maybe he meets some friends along the way. And then, like, maybe at the end is where he's trying to get to Tommy. That's kind of the final goal. And you find out maybe Tommy got killed, or, it builds up to that. But like I said, I just never really got invested when he's doing all this stuff. Like, when he goes to the really hot area, or the really hot LZ, where there's, kind of all this fighting, and he's, kind of had this humorous moment where he's, in one of the places, and he's like putting a tarp over himself to hide for his friend that's, running through literally gunfire to get there, kind of has a nice humorous moment there. And, we see kind of this, finally these friends getting together, And the whole time I'm thinking, okay, like, yay, I guess. Like, I didn't really have much of emotional impact. And I think that was the biggest issue I had without the whole thing with the greatest beer run ever was there was too many characters. We never really got to know anybody outside of Chickie. So then you just don't have that much investment, or at least that's the way I view it. I just didn't get that much investment. I think they spread it too thin, and it just make it a weaker story overall.
Well, I mean, what I really liked about that movie was the fact that Chickie starts off, I would say as a one-dimensional character, but he's the sort of hawkish, patriotic guy who's like,
Yep.
well, there's a reason why we're in Vietnam, and our government would never lie to us, and all these protesters, you guys are a bunch of shitheads who just want to bring everybody down and have our troops killed. And as he progresses through Vietnam, as he's going through all these journeys, he begins to see the reality of it, and he sees that his friends aren't as emotionally invested in the cause as he would like to be. Now, true, we don't get to see that that much of his friends, but when it comes to the conflict itself, I mean, there really is no time to kind of just slow down and kind of just think things through, because and I think that and I think the movie kind of does a pretty good job in just capturing the fast pace of everything, because Chickie wants to spend more time with his friends, but obviously he can't, because he's in a situation where people are literally getting killed and blown up all around him, like at LZ Jane, for instance. That I think that's supposed to be like one of the most dangerous parts of the
Yes.
Of Vietnam, and there were no flights or anything over there. So by the time he gets back home, and he's sitting at docks, he basically comes to the realization, oh yeah, it's not controlled chaos. It's not a war that that our dads and granddads fought. It's just chaos over there.
Yes.
It's that for me, it's that growth and development where he comes to realize, maybe things aren't as black and white. And you kind of see him at the end where he's at the park and he and his sister sit down and they have a beer together. And it's kind of that reconciliation where they come to realize, maybe neither one of us is completely right.
Yeah.
Maybe we have half of the truth. Maybe we're both right to a degree, but we're not completely right. That's what I enjoyed about
Yes,
that
yeah.
movie.
And don't get me wrong, right? Chickie's character was really good, right? And exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, there is a whole lot of growth within him. So I don't want to dismiss that at all. I totally agree that his development from beginning to end was really strong. And it's exactly for the reasons you said, because, it is very chaotic, right? It's not like, it's very clear cut. Like you got one people on one side, one people on the other. You got, fighting out in the streets. You have the whole sequence where, there's, I believe it's the Tet Offensive that was depicted, where, you have all this stuff going on, like right there. And that's where, we kind of get to see more of Russell Crowe's character. But yeah, like it just really shows the chaos. And I think that's where he sees Lieu out there, a guy that he had met that, kind of build this, little bit of rapport with, and he sees him out there. And he's dead, right? A guy that, he'd been chatting with and everything like that. And I think it goes to your point that it kind of turns around his mindset and his thinking for it. And, he comes back, someone a lot more jaded to really everything that's going on. And, there is a lot of unfortunate, the reality is that the reason he sees depictions of, soldiers and everyone dead is because that's what's happening every single day. And I think that's a very sobering, for a lack of a better term, a very sobering experience for him in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because I mean, like with Cronauer in Good Morning Vietnam, when he arrives, you kind of get the feeling he's this happy-go-lucky kind of guy, because he spends most of his time in Crete before he gets transferred. But then by the end of the movie, after experiencing everything that he's done, he's a bit more sober-minded.
Yes.
In that, so I mean, so both characters, undergo metamorphosis, throughout their respective experiences in Vietnam. So I want so sticking to the greatest beer run ever. What did you think of the other characters in the movie, like Doc, for instance, who's played by Bill Murray, the old World War II vet who I remember one of the lines from the beginning of the movie is like, there's a good reason why we didn't have TV, in my time, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, they have some moments, right? And I think this goes back to kind of my earlier, one of my challenges with it is that everything is spread so thin and they spend so little time with everybody. I think probably the one that had the most, probably spent the most time with was actually probably Russell Crowe. I
Mhm.
don't actually know. Who would you consider, like, who's he interacted with the most in the movie? Who do you think?
Um, I'd probably say it was a split between Doc and Russell Crowe's character.
Yeah. See, I don't know. Doc just felt like, I mean, I don't know. I didn't really get that strong of a thing. I think for Russell Crowe, and I guess I'll let you talk about more about Doc. But like as far as like Russell Crowe goes, like I think it was, I thought his interactions were, very true to what's going on. He's somebody that, I think has seen more, he's experienced more. And when he first meets Chickie, it's like, what is this, young pup trying to say to a grizzled old guy like me, who's really seen this shit all the time, right? Chickie did serve, and I believe it doesn't. He never saw combat or anything like that, but he was a part of the military, just like his dad. So for Chickie's character, he does have that very strong sense of it's a prideful thing to serve, and this is your duty. So there's a lot of patriotism with them, and talking with a guy that is just very straight laced and is just fine with showing you like, hey, this is the reality of what it is. Like, you can believe whatever you want, but I'm telling you right now, I've seen some shit. And I think that I really like what Russell Crowe brought to his performance, because he does bring kind of that grizzled attitude that, hey, man, like, you might have a different mindset or you might not be happy with the way that we're portraying things, but this is the reality that I'm dealing with every day. And, I think that, it's easy for people, thousands of miles away to have a sense of, like, hey, you should be doing something different. But I'm right there, not in the front line, so to speak, but I'm there where everything is happening, and I understand a lot about what's going on. So I think Russell Crowe, all accent stuff aside, I think did a really good job with the limited screen time that he had.
Well, I was gonna say because when I was thinking about it earlier, I mean, basically Doc and Russell Crowe, they sort of represent the I guess you can say they're sort of like the external representations of Chickie's shift because Doc,
Yeah, that's a good point.
yeah, because think about it, I mean, Doc is a World War II vet. I mean, he served at the
Hmm.
Battle of the Bulge. He's seen a lot of things, just as much as Russell Crowe's character has. But Doc, the way I see it is Doc tends to filter it through a different lens than say Russell Crowe's character. I
Yep.
I, I mean, would you say it's unfiltered because he's more open, whereas Doc is more like, yeah, I've seen and done all these things, and I've done horrible things and I've seen horrible things done, but but we were still in the right, and what we're doing today in Vietnam is in the right, so therefore it has to be in what it has to be this, it can't be that. He's more of a black and white kind of character, which pretty much reflects Chickie's mindset at the beginning of the movie, but after his experiences and when he comes back and to the hotel and he chats with Russell Crowe's character, um his mindset begins to shift, like I said earlier, and Russell Crowe kind of represents that external shift where yeah, maybe he hasn't been in the military, maybe he hasn't done the same things that Doc has done, but he's been witness to as many egregious and horrible things as anybody else. um
Yeah,
and
because I mean, he was out there during the offensive, right? Like, we see
yeah.
him running around with the camera, right? I mean, he's right there in the conflict. Like, people are like within, a few hundred feet of, seeing him, and there's bullets and everything go around. Like, he's, in there doing stuff. So yeah, like it definitely shows it, and I agree. I think for when I see something like this, it's like every war is a little bit different, right? Like I think, we start to see, we kind of think of, at least for, people from America, right? We think about, the American Civil War, we think about World War I, World War II. And, as we kind of progress, like the whole idea of war tends to kind of change very dramatically over time where, we kind of get more and more of that stuff. And I think like what Doc had experienced during his own experience is different from what the soldiers and everything are happening in Nam. So I think it's, somebody that's like old and grizzled that kind of experiences it, but maybe hasn't been there or experienced like what it is like currently. Whereas for Russell Crowe's character, he's someone that is not in battle. He's not out there in the front lines, but he's a lot closer to the situation and has continued to kind of be close to everything that's going on. So I think there is a lot of very interesting ways you could see those two characters and how they bring different ideas and understanding to what they're seeing, because it's all about like how you break down what you're seeing. And I think a lot of us, we see what we want to see, right? There's, always the whole talk about Democrats, Republicans, and all that nonsense that we see every day. People start to see one thing in a different lens more than the other because that's what they want to believe in. We all have that internal bias, whether we want to admit it or not. And I think everyone kind of has some of that. So it's up to you as the audience to kind of be like, okay, what part of this do I really want to follow and believe in?
Right. And I mentioned it before, but I mean, Chickie, sums it up perfectly. It's not, it's not controlled chaos. It's just chaos over there.
Yeah. Yep.
So, but I mean, overall, I mean, overall, both of these movies they sort of present they present the Vietnam War in pretty much a similar light.
Yeah.
It's not it's not a clear cut combat situation where it's the good guys versus the bad guys. It's this sort of thing where everybody kind of doesn't know who to trust or who to rely on.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, obviously, Good Morning Vietnam, does that perfectly because, we think of Tuan as like this innocent ingenue who is who's Cronauer's best friend, and you come to find out he's one of the VC. But at the same time, in Good Morning in Greatest Spirit Run Ever, even though we don't have something analogous to that, we can still see that there isn't a clear cut situation where where things are going to get any better. It's just going to get even worse.
Yep. Yeah, and I love how they both, like you said, they just depict the chaos of the situation, right? It's not black and white, right? There's lots of gray, and it's not like thinking back to World War II, right, where it's like hey, like we have very clear cut who the enemy is, like who the good guys and bad guys are, right? It's a lot more clear cut. Like, yes, I'm sure there's always some challenges with somebody a soldier, somebody not, or if it's just like an innocent bystander. But it was a lot more clear cut. Whereas I feel like, as we've seen with the Vietnam War and everything like that, obviously it's very different, where it is not as straightforward. And I think that level of you don't know what to trust, like all that distrust, I think really just builds upon how like truly depressing it is. Like you don't know who to believe in, you don't know what to trust. You don't even know who the real enemy is. You're just there fighting, and you hope that what you're doing is for some form of greater good. But I think it gets depicted that it's kind of hard to tell what that is, right? You have Tuan sitting there talking about the stuff where, I would assume before everything that happened to Tuan, he probably wouldn't have been a part of the Viet Cong, right? That's at least the impression I got. I got the feeling that because he watched his, mom, his brother, his neighbors, the reason that he ends up being a part of the Viet Cong was because he saw them get killed, and got killed probably for something that totally was nothing. It wasn't intended for them to die, or they shouldn't have died. So you start to see that, and I think that just does such a great job of depicting that. Whereas, The Greatest Spirit Run Ever, I think it also does a decent job, right? Because you see a guy like He, who was just an innocent bystander in this whole thing, that gets gunned down in the street, and this was a guy, he was not out there hurting anybody. He was just trying to support, the people in the city that he lived in. So I think that because we see so much of that ambiguity, it does create a very strong narrative. And I think both of these movies did a great job of kind of depicting that.
Well, I was going to say, do you remember that scene where Chickie's in the helicopter? And
Yes,
there was that
the
CIA
CIA.
guy, and they're
Yep.
interrogating that guy, and the guy's saying, "Well, I don't know anything," and Chickie just says, "For God's sake, just make something up." And the
Mhm.
guy does, and then the CIA guy's like, "Oh, thanks," and he tosses him out of the
Yeah.
helicopter. And then later on, when the helicopter lands, you see that. I mean, you could tell from the interpreter's face, he's like shaken up, like he's like, "What
Yes.
the fuck did I just see here?"
Yeah.
I mean, so that kind of gives you like a good idea of the kind of atrocities that are committed that would maybe motivate someone to do what Tuan would do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, they definitely depict it, right? And, I think that was definitely a very, tough scene to see, right? Because you do see it happen, and you see kind of the callousness of the guy that's interrogating that just casually throws someone out of the chopper. Same thing like when, Chickie's just kind of on the trail, right? He meets that little girl that's like, got a little ball in her hand.
Yeah.
And obviously we know as an audience, right? I mean, Chickie's not, he's not a soldier. He's not over there to harm anybody. But you could see like when this girl interacts with him, she just starts crying, right? And you could see like Chickie's whole expression changes because like, the reality is she's crying because he's an American, right? It has nothing to do with like he doesn't have a gun. He's not out there purposely doing anything. She just has such a great fear for her life that she sees someone that she understands that people that look like this Chickie person, they've killed people or kill people close to me. Like you just see that expression, like he's just trying to be so nice and give her the ball back, but she just will not. She just breaks down, and I think that's a very heartfelt scene. And I think we kind of see Chickie kind of have that very different demeanor, how he just like goes from kind of giving her that nice smile to just like looking super depressed that somebody is just that upset about seeing him just because of everything else that's going on, not from anything that he did, but because people that look like him are doing something, then him by default is lumped together with that same group of people.
Yeah, painting in broad strokes, basically.
Yes, yeah, very broad strokes. Yes.
So nothing I want to bring up too, because Good Morning Vietnam obviously takes place in Vietnam. Whereas when The Greatest Beer Run Ever is kind of split between what you see, back in the States and what's going on in Vietnam. So it's kind of like a 50-50 split. And what I really, really liked about that is you see what the attitude's like at home, because you see the society that's divided, and the Donohue family is a microcosm of what's going on in America, where there's like a division between the older generation, like the dad, the grandma, and and the younger generation, with Chickie's sister, who's out protesting and just basically saying, we got to bring our troops home because this is a pointless war. And it kind of goes back to what you were mentioning earlier about trust, because obviously Chickie, he's toting the party line. He's toting the party line. He's basically saying the government would never lie to us. But when he gets there, it's like a complete 180. He's saying all these crazy things, and and you remember his interaction with Halberstrand, because he thinks he's a spook from Langley, and they keep asking. They're like, "Hey, so do you guys know what you guys' plans are?" He's like, "No, I don't know anything. I'm just bringing beer." And they're like, yeah, typical CIA. You can't. They don't tell us anything." And it's like a recurring gag almost, where he just shows up in different places, and the soldiers are like, "Man, these guys don't tell us shit about anything."
Yeah, I do have to admit, I did find the whole CIA gag pretty funny. Like, it's just like he kind of stumbles from place to place, and like just because he looks so out of place, everyone's just like, "Oh, I guess he's CIA." That's the only logical thing.
But to get the point that I'm getting across here, because it's like even among the military and the top brass, there's no trust between any of them. So there's like that huge level of distrust, not only with with the people in the country that they're fighting among the Vietnamese, but it's also among their own ranks because they don't know who to trust. Because obviously the military's not going to trust the CIA, and the CIA is not going to say anything to the military. They're off doing their own thing. So I want to go ahead and wrap this up, but I want to do something different this time around. Normally we give scores, but this time, since we're reviewing two movies, I want to ask, out of the two movies that we reviewed, which one is your favorite and why?
Yeah, so I'm gonna say that Good Morning Vietnam to me was the superior film.
Mm-hmm.
I think, kind of taking a step back and talking about it as a film, maybe not just specifically about the depiction of it being the Vietnam War. I think that Good Morning Vietnam just does a better job of doing it. Number one, right? They're both comedies. I think the comedy elements, I was definitely laughing a lot more in Good Morning Vietnam as opposed to The Greatest Bear Run Ever. So I think they did a better job with the comedy. And I think the story beats, right? I just liked it in Good Morning Vietnam more than The Greatest Bear Run Ever. I felt that, for me, the story just, I thought, was a lot stronger because it was a lot more centralized, a lot more focused on a smaller group of characters. And I think because of that, it got that much more impact to it, right? Like, if you didn't spend as much time with Tuan, the impact at the end would not nearly have hit so hard if it was just kind of like a character that was thrown in there that we saw from time to time, because he was very central to the story. To me, that just, adds so much more weight towards the end where everything kind of unravels and it's like, oh my gosh, like, this character we've been following the whole time that seems to be this, happy-go-lucky person. He just creates this really strong bond with this Vietnamese kid, and you find out that he's quite a dangerous fellow, right? He's definitely made some very, he's done some catastrophic things, and I think that just creates a better story. The Greatest Bear Run Ever, it really, to me, got stronger and stronger as it went on. I think the biggest challenge for me was I just felt that there was just so many aspects of it that just felt glossed over. And I feel like it didn't earn kind of the level of kind of that whole shift in demeanor that we saw with Good Morning Vietnam, because it just felt like there was just too much. There was just not enough focus on Chickie, his relationship with his friends. I think if you did that, it would have been better. It was, oddly enough, I felt like a movie that either was too short and also too long at the same time, which is really weird to say, but I felt like, if maybe you cut out like more of the stuff in New York and you focused on more of the stuff with his friends, it would have been better. Or you could have kept everything the way it is, because I think it was good, but you needed to show more of the story. So I think it just kind of didn't quite get where it needed to. And I think that's because it just tries to condense too much story into too little screen time, and it just misses the mark a little bit. That's not to say it's a bad film at all. I think that it was definitely better than I was expecting, but I don't think it really holds up to Good Morning Vietnam.
So I'm gonna be the contrarian, as I always am in these discussions.
You gotta be kidding me. I want to hear this. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Let's hear it.
Look. Good Morning Vietnam is a good movie. All right. I will defend that movie, but at the same time, having watched The Greatest Bear Run Ever, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I thought it did a perfectly good job in capturing the microcosm of America, at that time in the late '60s, where people were beginning to question, what was going on in Vietnam and kind of standing up to the government. And yeah, things were all over the place, but as I said before, the situation in Vietnam isn't as clear cut as you've seen in previous wars. I mean, there's just chaos everywhere. The fact, I mean, with the central character of Chickie Donohue, yes, he starts off as a bit rough around the edges. He's a bit one-dimensional, but he grows throughout the movie. And the best way that he does it is that he witnesses the things that his friends are going through. And yeah, we don't get to see too much of the interactions with his friends. I'll grant you that, but but for me, coming from the experiences that I've had with talking to people and having family who've lived through that period in history, you know, as much as these people are important to us, as much as Chickie's friends are important to him, you know, they're just they're just passing through life. They're just passing through because at the end of the day, they're not, they're they're not significant in the greater scheme of things, which is a heartbreaking thing to realize. And if you've ever been to the Vietnam War Memorial, I mean, you see those names etched on on that black stone, like tucked into the in the earth. They're just at the end of the day, these are individuals, these are people who are important to us, but to the wider scope of the conflict, they're just another statistic. And for me, for me, just to see Chickie trying to cling on to the significance of his friendship by going on the spear run, trying to locate his friends and doing his best to bring presents to them from back home. It shows that it shows that these aren't just name figures without any significance. These aren't just people without names. These aren't just faceless soldiers. These are people who have lives and who have hopes and aspirations and fears. And that discussion that he has with Tommy at the bar, I think, is a pretty powerful scene because it shows that the people who fought this war, they had to put up with a lot of shit. They had to put up with a lot of expectations from their government. Had to put up with the potential of being reviled when they came home, but they did their duty all the same. And to me, it was just such a moving scene because, at least for me anyway, having watched that, it's this realization that it's a it's that the people who fight these wars, they aren't things aren't always going to be as clear cut. Yeah, they're going to go to war because it's their duty and it's what's expected of them. But that isn't to say that these are people who don't have their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own trepidations about doing the things that they do. I remember watching Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War, and they were interviewing this one soldier, and he was saying, back home in Minnesota, just walking out the street isn't an act of courage. But, when you're out in the bush, just making your legs move is an act of courage because you don't know what's going to happen, with the next step. And what you see these guys go through, yeah, I mean, we don't spend too much time with them, but what they're doing is just so courageous, having to put their necks out there to to fight this war that may or may not make sense. And the fact that Chickie is there, interacting with them, it kind of shows this level of humanity. Even in a place like Vietnam where things just go to shit and there's just chaos everywhere. Him just being there and him just doing what he does, it may seem silly and stupid, but it it's that realization that there's still humanity and everybody, and every human being deserves to have crack a smile every once in a while. Everyone deserves to kind of just relax a little bit and not have to worry about making the next step or going to ponds or getting blown up or anything like that. So I'm probably reading way more into this than I should, but that's why I love that movie.
No, I mean that's good. Yeah, and I guess I think that goes to just show like we could have two very different outlooks on it. Because like I think brought up a good point, right? Like there is a lot about the conflict. Like we don't really see that a whole lot in Good Morning Vietnam. It really just it's a lot more. I think kind of like focus on like this very small portion of the world, whereas the Greatest Beer Run Ever, we definitely get a lot more of the other aspects of it. So yeah, I can see where you're coming from, where we definitely get more of a depiction about the war and everything that's going on with it is definitely a lot more prevalent in the Greatest Beer Run Ever, as opposed to Good Morning Vietnam.
Well, well, that's going to wrap it up for our review of these two movies. But before we sign off, we just want to give a shout out to all of our veterans from all the conflicts. Thank you so much for your service, and we love you and we support you, and you will have no haters here on the podcast. That's for sure. But let us know down in the comments below what you think. If you agree with our choices, if you think Lee had it right, or if I'm just talking shit as usual. But as always, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and as always, thank you so much for watching, and take it easy.